Okay, we're ready to begin our next session. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Paul Dickler. I work at FPRI. If you have any questions or problems during the weekend, feel free to contact me, ask me. It's time for our next speaker. Farhad Kazemi is Professor of Politics and Middle Eastern Studies at New York University. He served as NYU's Vice Provost, Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Chairman of the Department of Politics, and Director of the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. He has also served as President of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and of the International Society for Iranian Studies. He's a member of several professional organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, and he served as trustee of several academic institutions, currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the American University in Cairo. He has also served as a consultant to the U.S. government. Kazemi is a specialist in comparative and international politics and Middle Eastern politics. A former editor of Iranian Studies, he's authored several articles, books, and edited volumes on politics in the Middle East, particularly in Iran. He recently served as a member of the U.S. Government Commission on Public Diplomacy in the Arab and Muslim world. He has traveled and lectured extensively in the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and Asia, and has taught at the University of Michigan and has held visiting positions at Princeton, Penn, and Oxford. He has also held the Nazarian Visiting Lectureship at Tel Aviv University. It is a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker.
You're too kind. Good morning. A caveat, I have a lingering cold, so if I have to cough every now and then, please bear with me. It's a pleasure to be here as an educator and talk to teachers who train the next generation, and especially a privilege for me to have Amin Tarzi here as one of the members of this panel. I have a PowerPoint. The lecture is a bit dense. Please bear with me. If you look at every side of the PowerPoint when I'm talking, it'll probably make it easier for you to follow. If I'm being too inarticulate, just raise your hand and I'll try to do otherwise. Okay, first, I have 6 major points and 1 conclusion. And the 6 major points will come one after the other. First is geopolitics. I'm very pleased with your comment about geography and so forth, because while I'm not a geographic determinist, I also believe geography has something to do with power and influence. Now, in regard to Iran, the geographic pattern is very, very interesting and gives the country certain advantages that it has used historically. For example, oil and natural gas. It has, where Iran is located in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, where the majority of oil and gas reserves are held. Not only that, of course, there's also on the north, the Caspian Sea, and as we find more and more in the Caspian. So geographically, there are natural resources. There's no other country that straddles 2 major centers, especially across the Gulf, at the same time. As you know, about 55 to 60% of the proven oil reserves are in the Gulf, and Iran has the 2nd largest reserves in both oil and gas in the region. If you look at the map, a geographic map, or natural map, so to speak, you also view the way Iranian borders, so to speak, on the water, and it's quite dramatic. Let me give you some facts and figures. In the northern Gulf, there are 615 miles from Iraqi border up that Iran has to the Straits of Hormuz. A very key, obviously, bottleneck or any kind of a problem in the future. On the Straits of Hormuz, it has 1,356 nautical miles. The next nation state, come even close to that, is UAE with 733. In addition, Iran has 480 kilometers on the Arabian Sea, and the port of Chabahar, and the route to South Asia, Pakistan, and so forth and so on. So it's a geographically very well-connected country in terms of natural resources. Then there is a second one, which is the Alborz and Zagros Mountains, two huge mountain ranges in the country. They go from north to south and east to west. And it links, again, Iran, geographically, very importantly, to Central Asia and the Caucasus. So there's all kinds of linkages provided by this geographic situation. So Iran straddles both the Middle East and Central Asia and has been a player in that both regions for quite some time, sometimes victorious and sometimes, of course, defeated. Then there's a third factor, which is the Persian cultural heritage. There's an aphorism that we academics use a lot of times about Islam and Islamic civilization, which says that the Arabs gave the Muslims their religions, the Turks gave them the military and the army, and the Persians gave them administration and culture. Whether that's completely true or not, it has some resemblance to reality. And for the Persian part, it also brought the route to India, Afghanistan, India, and further in South Asia. The points of interest from the Persian cultural heritage has been Herat in Afghanistan, has been obviously Iraq because of the Shi'i shrines, or primarily in Iraq, not in Iran, in the Levant, with Lebanon, Syria, and of course, Central Asia. So this pattern historically continues to the present time. Now I want to go to the next item. A kind of a comment about national identity and the kind of a historical challenges that Iran has had. As you know, national identity has several characteristics. It's territory, language, religion, ethnicity, and culture broadly defined. Crisis happens in national identity when one or more of these elements are not in conformity with each other. And Iran has had that crisis at least three major times historically. I'm sorry, we went a little too. Okay. First is Alexander's conquest and the impact of Hellenism on Iran. And the response to this crisis was Artaxerxes' attempt and the creation of the Sassanid dynasty, another major dynasty in Iran. And more importantly, the Sassanians made Zoroastrianism the state religion of Iran. Another significant bond that brought people of diverse origins, ethnicity, together under one banner, a major empire with a state religion being Zoroastrianism. So this was the response to the challenge and was successful. The second one was the Arab domination of Iran and the advent of Islam in the 7th century. This was the collapse of the Sasanian Empire, and the response here by the Iranians was a form of a compromise, how to rekindle national identity again. One compromise was adoption of Islam, but very importantly, preservation of Persian language, literature, and poetry. This is a very significant factor because you compare Iran to another great civilization, even perhaps greater, which is Egypt. The Egyptians lost the language, but the Iranians never did. That was another force of national identity and bringing the people together. The second one, which I'll come to later on, happened much later, which is in 1501, which is the adoption of Shi'ism as the state religion of Iran. Please remember that until 16th century, the majority of Iranians were Sunni, not Shi'i. Under the Safavid dynasty, 1501, when the country was conquered and so forth by the tribal group, they made Shi'ism the state religion. So another bond was put together. And the reason I make this point is that Shi'ism and Iranian national identity have been in congruence for many, many centuries. Finally, the last challenge is the Western challenge. In some way, this is the most dramatic and the strongest challenge to the Iranian identity because it appears at a time of national weakness. Slogans that the regime has used, neither West nor East, but the Islamic Republic, are just that. They are slogans. retrogression into the past is not an answer for a successful activity in the age of globalization. These kind of a slogan and the challenges may work for internal consolidation for the regime, but in the long run, it will not for perpetuity. So the Western challenge is real and alive and is connected to many of the people and has not had a proper response so far. Now let me move to the next element, and this is the historical political traditions that Iran has had for the past several centuries. And this is very complex and particularly comes to force after the Second World War, but it essentially has 4 points, 3 major and 1 minor. The tradition of monarchy, the tradition of liberal nationalism, and the tradition of religion, and a small tradition of the left. Allow me for a few minutes to deal with all of these things one by one. The monarchical tradition, of course, has the deepest root in Iran. It is intertwined with Persian mythology, symbols, and the great legacy of epic poetry. The Book of Kings, that the great poet Shahnameh, it really encapsulates this whole thing. The most recent expression of monarchy was, of course, the Pahlavi dynasty, which came to power in 1925 and was abolished in 1979. The Pahlavi monarch, the last monarch particularly, Mohammad Reza Shah, the regime was based on the military. It was during the Pahlavi era, the Shah's father, that the national standing army based on universal male conscription was actually put into effect. Iran has had many significant major empires, but it never had, until 1920s and 30s, a national standing army based on universal male conscription. So the military and the monarchy, going historically back, but the more modern period, are again 2 points that have gone together. I like to use the phrase, they were the 2 sides of the same coin. It is therefore not surprising that after the success of the Islamic Revolution, the first group that was purged by the revolutionaries was the Iranian military, executed, put in jail, etc., and the creation of an army, a military, that is totally devoted to the Islamic Republic. Thus, IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And of course, as we know, as Amin also pointed out, this group has increased in power, prestige, and wealth, especially in the past decade or so. So this is one tradition, very important in the minds of any Iranian, but of course is now abolished. The second major tradition is the tradition of, sorry, may I just add one more on the, okay, monarchy, fine. We did reverse those two, put religious in front of the other one. My notes and my power outline don't go quite together. The religious tradition has been very important for a long, long time, but especially after Shiism became state religion. And the most significant figure in the modern period, but not the only one, to be attached to this tradition is no other than Ayatollah Khomeini. The institutional base of the religious tradition, historically, always, has been the mosque and the bazaar. Remember I mentioned with the monarchy and the military, 2 sides of the same coin? Well, we have a 3-sided coin here. It is the religious tradition. One side is the bazaar, the other side is the mosque. And all of you know, as educators, that historically, there has been tremendous amount of relationship between commerce and religion in the Islamic civilization. And this is no different here. The bazaar of Iran basically bankrolled the revolution, and in cooperation, obviously, with the religious mosques and so forth. Now, we know that the importance of the bazaar has declined recently, partly because the locus of economic activity has moved somewhat outside the bazaar to the financial districts of Tehran, Isfahan, and other major cities. But bazaar is still important, especially in trade and in currency. Those of you who follow the Iranian affairs closely were aware that about 2 weeks ago, there was significant, very large, you get all this through YouTube, thank God for YouTube, of the bazaar of Tehran, in spite of the regime's urging not to do so, closed totally, and thousands, the number nobody knows, were walking the streets with slogans against the devaluation of the Iranian currency, the rial. Nobody dared to say anything against the regime, but the message was very clear that the bazaar was asserting its importance again, even though it has lost some power, and it wants to know that economic crisis is affecting them, sanctions, in a very dramatic fashion. Then let me go to the tradition of liberal nationalism. This is also very important, and the roots of that basically go to the modernization efforts of the last two dynasties before the revolution in Iran, sending students abroad, doing reform of various things and so forth and so on, and especially the concept of liberal nationalism was imported from Europe by the students who became important, significant people in politics into Iranian life. This is a very, by the word liberal, it's not liberal conservative dichotomy. I'm just talking liberal in terms of openness to ideas from abroad and the sense of national identity and nationalism be a part and parcel of a larger tradition which includes different groups with different religious and ethnic backgrounds in its side. The hero, or the figure most important with the Iranian liberal nationalism, is no other than Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, to which I make a reference, who nationalized the oil industry as prime minister in 1951 and was toppled by our CIA and MI6 of the British in 1953. The institutional base of liberal nationalism, in contrast to the other two traditions, was a bit weak. It was a kind of an amorphous group, was not exactly a political party, but was something like that, known as the National Front. And to this day, there are a lot of Iranians who have tremendous amount of sympathy to liberal nationalism and so forth, and a tiny bitsy group of them still alive and active in Iran, led by one of the foreign ministers of the regime who are now in the doghouse. So it is a tradition that has not died out in terms of its impact on Iran. My personal prejudicial hope is that that tradition will become alive sometime in the future. But as the Arabs say, Allahu Alam, God knows it. Then finally, there is a minor tradition, which is the tradition of the left. I want to emphasize the word minor, because the left never became so significant in Iranian politics as the other three traditions. It emerged after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and all those, again, students, others who went there to study and so forth. It was finalized in a political party known as the Iranian Communist Party. It is known with the name Tudeh, T-U-D-E-H, which in Persian means masses. Tudeh party was very active and many times. It had a network in the military and so forth. It was underground, banned under the Shah, and was also banned under the Islamic Republic. During the revolution, several offshoots of the left formed guerrilla movements that helped topple the regime. You've been hearing about our State Department now no longer putting MEK, the Mujahideen, as a terror list, where they were one of the elements that were very instrumental in the grand revolution that toppled the regime. So the left is out in Iran. It's more relevant now in thoughts of academics and historians than in reality. Each, of course, tradition, all four of them, has consistently tried for power, wealth, and status. The three key forces that, in my view, drive politics. These traditions have sometimes cooperated with each other In some other times, they have fought very viciously and violently against one another. After the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, essentially the religious tradition has eliminated the other three, and it has its own ever-changing factions, but that's the dominant one. Now, I just wanted to go to the point relevant to the last thing I was saying. In Iranian politics and themes of history, there's a very peculiar, strange bedfellow coalition. We all know politics makes strange bedfellows, but this is a little more strange than usual. Historically, going back to 19th century, there has been a grand coalition, alliance, of different political groups, different traditions that I mentioned, against regimes. This is referred to loosely by academics as the liberal clerical alliance. It actually should have a third term, liberal clerical merchant alliance. These were the three essential groups that at certain times came together against the absolutist monarch's abuse of power, against foreign powers that were interfering in domestic affairs, and for fear of economic demise, if not total collapse. So aside from their different worldviews and all that, they came together essentially 5 times. And I'm not going to go through those, there's no point for that. The Reuter concession, after the famous Reuter was given a concession for mines and other things of Iran. The tobacco concession was the banning of strike over smoking of tobacco. So Iranians are very advanced on those issues. And the constitutional revolution, the first major revolution of that type in the Middle East. The oil nationalization, the Mossadegh era. And then I put in brackets the National Front and Khomeini. Why in brackets? Because it wasn't an alliance and coalition. In 1961, National Front rose again against the Shah's dictatorship. But it was put down. Leaders were put in jail and so forth. No other violence was done. Then in 1963, for the first time, people hear the name of Ayatollah Khomeini. He rose in a rebellion of 1963, June 63, against the Shah's regime and against the various alliances that Iran had with the US and the West. And of course, he was arrested. They were going to behead him, but some other Ayatollah said, you cannot behead an Ayatollah. So he was exiled to Turkey and later to Iraq and then to France and came back to Iran. So it's not exactly a coalition, but it is something that is related in a loose fashion in 3-year period. Finally, we have the Islamic Revolution, which was the final grand alliance. Remember, the revolution did not begin by the religious groups. It began by intellectuals, by the intelligentsia. But the religious group, because they were so well organized, they were able to use the bazaar and the mosque, mobilize the people, and eventually succeed and push the others out of the system. In all those 5 alliances, except for the last one, clerics were the losers. It is only in the last major grand alliance, Islamic Revolution, that the clerics were able to come to the top and eliminate the others. Okay, let's go to the next frame, which is some observation on these very long historical overviews on political traditions in Iran, of the situation as most people feel within that country and those of us who studied from abroad. One of them is a very strong element of insecurity. I mentioned that the Afghans and Tajiks and Iranians speak Persian. There's also many important Persian pockets all around, but fundamentally Iran is in the sea of Arab world. So that has always been an issue historically. But the insecurity I'm talking about, if you want to refer to it, environmental insecurity, is something a bit different, more recent. Since 1979, as we all know, there have been significant internal and external crises in Iran of unprecedented degree and form. And these crises and the perception of them have made people very, very insecure. What are these crises? Well, let me mention some of them. There has been, of course, the revolutionary process. It has been the Iran-Iraq war, the longest war of the 20th century, with the use of poison gas. I mean, it's just one of the worst wars ever. The American hostage crisis, and I must say I'm personally very concerned about that because 3 of my very close friends were among the hostages, including John Limbert, my classmate. The Islamization of society. When Khomeini was in Paris, he was talking about democracy, oil for the Iranians, not for the purchase of AWACS and so forth and so on. But that wasn't the case. Eventually, there was an attempt to Islamize society in Iran, an invention of the concept of the supreme jurisprudent, the supreme leader. In other words, the authoritarian features of society were emphasized as time went on, with a very strong element, obviously, of religion attached to that. Then at the same time, you had significant international issues to be afraid of and deal with. What are they? Very clearly, collapse of the USSR, the arrival of 6 new republics on the Iranian border, neighborhood, problems in relationship with in the Persian Gulf, but also with obviously Iraq and in Afghanistan, with the Taliban. Then issues and problems, terrorism in Europe, in Argentina, and elsewhere. And very importantly, for the first time, Iran has become an active participant in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Obviously, the friendship with Israel is no longer, it's changed dramatically in '79, but has become a participant in a very clear fashion in that issue, which was never super high priority before. Okay? That's one insecurity. One other one. Other one is a question of leadership. If you look historically at Iran, you realize that leadership, political leadership, is highly personalistic. The cult of personality has been the norm. Doesn't matter whether tradition was liberal nationalism or religious or left or monarchical. Always a problem with democracy in Iran has been this cult of personality and personality worship, which continues to the present time. Another one is family and group ties. They are dominant in politics and in gaining the spoils of anything that the regime does. Used to be a comment that people made before the revolution that Iran is the country of 1,000 families. Well, that 1,000 is gone. And now we have another 1,000 families of the clerics who play the same functions. A great scholar, Italian scholar, Pareto, one time wrote a book talking about the circulation of elites. Well, we had circulation of the elites, but not of the problematic issues. Personalism and family ties and so forth and so on. Furthermore, connected to that is the concept of patrimonialism. That is, those who are in charge, looking at the state as an extension of the regime. No distinction between public, or hardly any distinction, public and privy purse. In other words, you get rich by virtue of controlling the state and for your family and relationship. You are aware that historically the greatest case of corruption was the one that's happened in Iran about a few years ago. The parliament tried to deal with it. We're talking about a couple of $2 billion of corruption. It puts everything else into shame. And before that, there was a truck crossing the border of Iran into Turkey filled with American dollars and European euro. So this is an incredible amount of corruption that is, of course, there was corruption under the Shah's regime too, but has become systematic and systemic. Well, okay, maybe all those points are valid. Then what really drives Iranian politics now? Here I'm going to go back to some great scholars of the past and some great politicians. You all know, have heard it many times, the great speaker of the Congress of the House, Tip O'Neill, one time said that all politics is local. We all agree, and so forth. But I want to say that in Iran has been even more of a case. especially since the time of the revolution. If you want to understand what's happening in foreign policy, in any other aspect of the society, you have to put a very careful eye and ear on what's happening domestically, the changing factions and so forth and so on, the relationship between the supreme leader and the president, and so forth and so on. Okay? That's correct? Fine, that's the mindset. But let me go to another great scholar, Harold Laswell, the political scientist and legal scholar at Yale, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He wrote a tiny little book, which I read as a freshman in college in upstate New York. And the book was called Politics, Who Gets What, Where, When, and How. Well, let me apply this to the Iranian regime. Who gets it, of course, is the regime, right now without any doubt, the Shiite clerics. What do they get? Power, authority, wealth, and status. And of course, the control of the system. When? Since the victory of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. How is by any means available, both legal or extra-legal or vigilante. So that's the way the overview is. Now, Amin Tarzi in his comments said several times, I 100% agree with him, that Iran is a country of contradictions and paradoxes. And I want to point out some of those paradoxes and contradictions in the modern time to really drive the other points across. For example, in the social and cultural arena, you see unusual things. You see Shia Islamic dogma in a very rigid fashion, but then you also see incorporation of pre-Islamic symbols and paraphernalia. The poetry, epic poetry, other stuff that deals with monarchs and the victory of the people and so forth. You see restrictions and censorship, very heavy sometimes, on music, arts, and film, versus one of the most remarkable burgeoning of artistic creation in Iranian history. Many of you have seen the films, including the one that won the Oscar for the best foreign film recently. Of course, the guy who created the film is in trouble, but nevertheless. But it just doesn't make sense. Everything has to be censored, yet at the same time, you have this phenomenal artistic expression in that country. Banning of satellite dishes in Iran by a vote of the Iranian parliament, and the failure of actually being able to do that. There's a heavy fine. Initially, it was like equivalent of $2,500. I think they've raised it now, which is a lot of money in Iran. It's very different than New York or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. But they banned that, but very cleverly, Iranians found a way to get around it. And God bless China and South Korea. They found those satellite dishes the size of a palm. And so in daytime, they put them on top of those trees. In daytime, they bring it down, but at night they go up. And my God, you go to Tehran, you can see anything you want. Film, music, everywhere. Of course, many of these are gotten, extra legally. But everything is available. Iran is not like China was prior to Nixon's famous trip to that area. Iran is not unknown in that sense. They're connected in all forms and shape and electronically. After Israel is the second most wired country in the region, slightly higher than Turkey. So it is this kind of a paradox that you see. Okay, now, there is the Islamic republics of tremendous emphasis on morality and ethics, which is fine. They attack the ancien regime, the Shah's regime, for not paying attention to these matters. But then you look at what has happened since the revolution. In terms of numbers and percentages, there is more drug addiction, there is more alcohol dependency, and more prostitution than was ever in that country. So these two do not quite jive. Morality, ethics, pristine, pure family life, then all this tremendous amount of activities that really essentially underline norms that are not moral. prostitution is really incredible in Iran. The pyramid is so big and it's very difficult to control that, variety of reasons. Okay, let me just go to the area of economy to give you some more things about that. One of the issues during the revolution that was raised was the Iranian dependence on oil, and then oil being used to purchase arms from the West. And it was a very logical, and I think probably a proper attack. So one would expect that afterwards, due to this norm, dependency on oil would decrease. Now, dependency on oil as percentage of gross domestic product has actually declined somewhat, but not very much as percentage of the national budget. So you still have this dependency on one commodity for your national wealth. Also, as part of the Constitution and all that went with that, there was an attempt, or at least a principle, of diversifying the economy. By what they meant is to have private, public, and cooperatives that put them all together. Well, that hasn't happened. The state runs and controls everything. If it's not the state, are the parastate operations that respond to the supreme leader. What are they? These are the Islamic foundations, what known in Persian as Bunyads, B-O-N-Y-A-D-S. These are foundations that were created, most of them, after the wealth of the monarchy and the thousand families was taken away. They are foundations with billions of dollars in assets. Foundation for the martyrs, foundations for the disinherited, etc., etc., etc. They own land, they own shops, they own supermarkets, they own apartment complexes, etc., etc. And the head of these foundations reports not to the president, but to the supreme leader. And that person is selected by him. And connected to that, of course, is the Revolutionary Guards. This is not just a military force, it is also a major economic power. It also owns many things. It controls a lot of commerce going abroad and so forth and so on. Nobody knows for sure the extent to which they control the economy, but the rough guesswork by most economists who follow up is about 40%. So it is state-dominated with parastatal organizations of the economy much worse than ever before. Well, I mentioned the Revolutionary Guards. What about them? Here you see another paradox. Iran is very funny. It has two military forces. First was the regular army based on conscription, male conscription. Then, because they were not trusted, as we all know, Ayatollah Khomeini and others, they created the Revolutionary Guards. The two of them actually fought side by side, but not very much integrated during the Iran-Iraq War. To become a member of Revolutionary Guards, you have to pass a test about religious competence and family connection and so forth. But regular military, you get drafted, you have no choice. When Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1988, the Iranian regime decided to revise the constitution. And one of the issues that at that time they were dealing with is to try to consolidate some of the state institutions. So in theory and on paper, there's one military, but in fact there are two, and the dominant power is in the hand of the Revolutionary Guards, whose heads are appointed not by the president, but by the supreme leader. Now, how about paradoxes in politics? Well, you have a theocratic constitution in Iran. If you read it carefully, there are all kinds of republican features in that constitution. It talks about the supremacy of Shia Islam and so forth. At the same time, talks about the rights of the people. It's almost a notion borrowed from Jean-Jacques Rousseau from that brought over there. It has a lot of democratic paraphernalia, elections, etc., etc., etc. A president who is elected by the people, direct election, but he can be fired by the supreme leader under certain circumstances. Another incredible contradiction and paradox over here. And a president who does not control the judiciary one of the worst institutions in terms of democracy in Iran, state-supported foundations, and military intelligence or nuclear policy. So it's all these things go hand in hand. Then, of course, there's open election to the parliament. Oh, wonderful. Democracy in action. Not exactly. There is a body known as the Guardians' Council, or the Council of the Guardians, that they decide on the qualification of the candidates for the parliament and for presidency. This controlled body is the gatekeeper to elections. So yes, people can vote, but they can only vote for those who have been cleared by this council, and the council does not make any of its views known. It's yes or no. And at one time, they gave tests on Islamic law to some of the candidates, but they never revealed the results. Then is a question of, I mentioned the Islamization of the political order and so forth. Yes, all that. But at the same time, another paradox. The religious minorities of Iran, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, they have some degree of cultural autonomy, and they each have representation in the parliament. Armenians too, because of numbers. So there is this Islamization and so forth, but religious minorities have a place in that. With one major exception, and Zoroastrians too, I'm sorry. Major exception are the Baha'is. The Baha'is, which is probably the largest non-Muslim minority in Iran, about probably 300,000 now, they are not recognized as a religious minority. They have no representation anywhere, and they're under severe, severe attack. Some people would even call it a thing resembling genocide. I'm not sure I use that term, but it is. So there's, again, all these kind of issues involved. Then there is a very strong anti-Israeli stand by the regime, but this is not shared exactly by the rank and file of people. There is a regime, very important, a part of the Islamic Republic, to constantly have these anti-Israeli slogans, but the common woman and man in the streets doesn't quite share that. There was a chanting sometimes in Tehran and Isfahan, in the streets, young people, women and men, they said, I use it in Persian, Na Gaza, na Lebanon, faqat Iran. Neither Gaza, nor Lebanon, only Iran. Forget about those people, deal with their own situation. Strong, obviously, to some extent different now, pro-Arab, pro-Iraqi tendency and pro-Palestinian tendency by the regime. In contrast, I don't want to overdo that, but there is a residue of anti-Arab prejudices within the Iranian population. So it is, the regime can be pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab, and so forth to some extent, and things change, but there's also something to deal with among the rank and files of the population. A very strong anti-American posture, as Amin has said very clearly there, and he said it very clearly as well, with over 60% of population, every time there has been an opinion poll, being pro-American and warning of the opening of the relationship. So what has happened to all of these paradoxes and problems? Do you have another 10 minutes? Paradoxes. Well, this is very interesting, and to me, this especially as a social scientist. The result of this has been a dichotomous development of public and private spheres in Iran, no matter where you are. Of course, especially in the urban centers. Duality of this duality of private and public life is nothing new. We have some of that in our own country here, everywhere. But in Iran, it's very much, how shall I say, emphasized. It's juxtaposed dramatically as two spheres that don't go hand in hand. In the public sphere of Iran, everywhere, you have a rigid Islamic dogma that segregates population by gender in public space, enforces veiling of women, and the strict quotas are put on university admissions and government employment, and so forth. The quotas are to favor through adscription, revolutionary guards, those who fought in the war, etc., and the clerics, etc., etc. Loyalty in the public sphere is tested by obedience to the Islamic Republic. And if obedience is not there, sanctions will be used, both vigilante sanctions and otherwise. Now, this is public. I can go on this for a long time. The New York Times reporter, Elaine Sciolino, has a wonderful book on that, that some of you may want to read, has tons of pages about these two elements. Now, let me go to the private sector. Private sector is very different. It's a world behind high walls. This is a place where liberal worldviews are common and dominant. This is where the latest films, musical shows, and videos from the West are shown, especially from the US. This is a place where genders mix freely. Any kind of dressing is allowed. All forms of music, especially Persian rap, is used. Alcoholic beverages are freely available. And of course, Islamic garb and all that are discarded in favor of Western clothing. The people here feel that they possess private freedoms that is attainable here, but is not attainable in the public sphere. Now, who dominates the private sphere? It's the youth. You all know, you're all educators from your knowledge of history, that pro-democracy movements worldwide have been led by youth. And Iran is no exception. Even more so, all those people under the age of 30 or so, they are the ones who lead that. Connected to this point, and very important from my personal point of view, are the women of Iran. You saw the videos of 2009 elections, an objection to the rigged electoral policies. See how many thousands and thousands of women they say. Women are an essential force. And of course, women both old and young one. If Iran, women and youth are the harbingers of change for better. If Iran is ever going to become democracy, these are the two elements it has to depend on to achieve that. Let me give you some concluding remarks now. And these are more personal views than really academic and scholarly. If Iran is to flourish as a civilization, it must first connect to its rich culture of the past and its high points of achievements. Essential to this quest is the position of Persian language, literature, and poetry. Humanities, in other words. This has been historically the chief receptacle of Iranian national identity and will remain as such. Second, it must have a system of politics that is inclusive. Inclusiveness is essential, is a key factor. The political system must accept and tolerate the other. This includes borrowing and adapting positive foreign ideas, concepts, and systems of thought and action, especially from the West, and merging them into some Iranian concoction, if you wish. Finally, and related to my second point on inclusiveness, it is the notion of pluralism. This means acceptance in principle of comprehensiveness of cultures, not its isolation. It means not only one Islam, but varieties of Islam. Not only one type of Shiism, but different varieties of Shiism. Not only, as well as, of course, Sunnism, as well as Christian ideas, Jewish ideas, Zoroastrian ideas, and Hindu ideas, ideas with which Iranians have conversed historically for thousands of years. It means acceptance of religious and ethnic minorities as equal citizens of the nation. Well, if history teaches us anything, is that Iran will survive as a major civilization and hopefully a great civilization. But it will not flourish if its development is hindered by primordial and exclusivist sentiments. It has to include, not exclude. It has to borrow, not to reject, and then refine its position accordingly under the banner of openness and pluralism. It will otherwise suffer enormously. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, we'll take questions. Again, I would ask you to post your 10-card vertically so we can identify your questions. Timothy Connell, can you identify your school? Microphone over here.
Hi, I'm from Laurel School in Greater Cleveland. I have a question about the teaching of history. You talked about that early on, and particularly the way pre-1900 history is taught in Iran. And I'm curious, what is the emphasis? Is there great references to Cyrus the Great and the ancient Persians, the Muslim conquest, the Safavids, and sort of who are the heroes, and what kinds of things would younger, pre-college students be taught in Iran today?
Thank you. Very relevant question, obviously. Yes. Remember, the great historical site, of course, is Persepolis. And with all, that was probably the first great multi-ethnic, multinational empire ever created. And there was a debate at the time of the revolution, what to do with Persepolis. Some stupid types said, go and destroy it. Can you imagine? But it wasn't just connected to that alone, these debates. Also concerned about a great gem of a city known as Isfahan. That, of course, Isfahan had its greatness under the Safavid dynasty because it brought Shiism as stereotype. But some of those frescoes in Isfahan show semi-naked women, and they show wine, and this other stuff. And eventually, those wiser people among the revolutionaries put on many of these frescoes some curtains and saved it. The curtains are gone now, by the way. But it's been a debate, and for a long time. The debate has become much, much less so. The heroes remain Rostam, the great wrestler, those great monarchs of Iran, and obviously some of the great Shiite clerics, and so forth. So it's a mixture of that. In the, one of the first things a revolution group does always, and you all know this, is to change the education system. So all the textbooks of the Shah, which glorify the monarchy and so forth, have been replaced by textbooks that glorify the clerics and so forth. But some of these textbooks have changed, and there is even in academic publications now, to my great amazement, 15 years ago, a major Iranian historian, who is pro-religious, essentially, but very, very solid. I won't mention his name. He wrote an article published in Iranian Academic Journal in Persian, praising Reza Shah, the founder of Pahlavi dynasty, for reuniting Iran after the First World War, all the problems of that sort. But there are other things remain. It's a problematique, as the French say, but it's something that's alive. And you always have to be careful. You can talk about them, recite poetry, and so forth. You always have to be careful in academic or public sphere situations, not to cross the red line by going too far and denounce the clerics. That's a very, very important question. Thank you for that.
We have a question on that side from John Calvert, one of our subsequent speakers.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that Iran is one of the most wired countries in the region. I'm just wondering the extent to which the internet and social media are censored. I know they're monitored. I know, for example, several members of the Green Movement have been compromised as a result of their Facebook pages. But to what extent is it censored?
It's possible, I said Iran, but Turkey must be just as wired now, but it's different. But quite a bit more wired than the Arab world. Yes, I think China wins the prize for censorship, but Iran comes a very close second. And they have used the Chinese system of screens and all that all the time. They use it dramatically, of course, during the 2009 Persian Spring, that's what I call it, uprisings, and they use it continuously. But there is a limit to how much they can do. I mean, I get the stuff sent to me from there regularly. And as Amin mentioned, you can go on websites. Ayatollahs have websites, this has that, et cetera, et cetera. It's an attempt that has been reasonably successful by the regime, but hasn't been total. I cannot imagine that even Chinese can have total control of that. But it's definitely part of the censorship, and it continues on a regular and routine basis. Now, there's a blogger who's a Canadian American, a Canadian Iranian, and he was for a long, long time in Canada doing these blogs. He tried to be careful. He went to Iran. What do? They, of course, they put him in jail, and eventually, through the Canadian regime, he got out, and he said he doesn't dare to go back. But I said, do your blogs get into Iranians? He said, a lot of them do, because he gets an email. Apparently, there's a way, for some reason at Stanford University, there's a group that finds a way to redirect some of these things there must be very intelligent people. I don't know how to do that. But you can get a lot of that stuff. But systematically, the regime censors media and censors internet and censors various forms of social media. Absolutely.
We have a question in the back from Ingrid Lutz of Carmel Central School District in New York State.
Hi, my question just ties to the last question a little bit, that I was wondering how the religious regime is able to retain such power if there's such a strong undercurrent of liberalism, but you just partly answered that. But what would be the tipping point for the liberal movements to become the dominant public force?
I wish I could answer that properly. It's what I call a question we all have been dealing with for years and years. It's $1 million question, but a very good one. Nobody really knows. But the way the regime has established control in Iran has been through the Revolutionary Guards and all the parastatal organizations. Remember, just to give you one example, the foundation for disinherited, they take care of the families of those who were poor, underclass. And the foundation for the revolution in Iran-Iraq War, same way. The children, spouses, otherwise, mothers, fathers, they have a regular income from this foundation, which comes from the government and the foundation endowments. Then they also provide vacations for them to the Caspian Sea, Syria. The last time I was in Syria, I'm not going to go there now, in the Umayyad Mosque, there's a huge number of Iranian women. They come to Syria and they buy tons of American Western material, bring it to Iran and sell it in the open market. It's all around. So what I'm talking is about dependency on the regime. I say whether you like it or not. You have the Iranian civic organization, the Iranian government, not government, I mean civilian, what's the root? Bureaucracy. There are millions of people in Iran who their income is based on their job in the government. And they may not be political. Somebody just stamps something. And you multiply that by 4. You're talking about several million. There are, I mean, what's the number of Revolutionary Guards? Is it a good number we have? Yeah. You have that, plus all those that depend on that. Then there is that element known as Basij, the strike force of Revolutionary Guard. I've heard it was 1.2 million. I don't know if it's accurate or not. And all those. Then you have people who also serve in regular military. What I'm saying is that it's not just the dislike of the regime. The groundwork, I mean, what they're going to get. They had the revolution, and look what they got. They have another revolution, there's something very different. Don't forget, in a 2009 Persian Spring, they were not talking about regime change. Nobody. They were asking, where is my vote? Essentially. Their uprisings there was not anti-clerical, was not anti-Islamic, was not anti-Western, anti-American. No anti-anti. Just one thing. If I'm given civil rights, if I'm given parliamentary rights to vote, where is my vote? And of course, we saw. So it's dependency and then the use of force by the regime in order to make sure. And there is really no organized opposition within Iran because they haven't allowed it to happen. It's what would be, I don't know, the spark. I don't really know, but what I can tell you from my own reading of Iranian history and politics and culture, a regime like this, in total isolation, enemy of everybody on earth, in the region. Now even Turkey, one of the greatest allies, they're having a serious problem. Something of that sort cannot last indefinitely. But when will that happen? I use a Persian term, Khoda danas, God knows.
Okay, a question from Todd Whitman in the center in the back, Schuylkill Valley High School, Leesport, Pennsylvania.
Sorry, don't know how to use a microphone. Ingrid actually took my question. Thanks, Ingrid. As a follow-up, I just wanted to ask, based on that dichotomy of public and private life that you talk about, do you think there's any plausible possibility of change in Iran in the next decade? I mean, in your opinion, do you see, you just talked about how the regime controls all, makes that even beginning of opposition almost impossible, but do you see any plausible possibility of change?
This is all going to be guesswork. So, and I've learned over the years when you predict about the Middle East, almost 99% of the time it turns out to be wrong. So I'm a bit reluctant to answer you as important the question is, but I want to start with a quote from one of my great teachers, Karl Deutsch, who was discussing a question of power and enforcement of power, force. And he said, there has to be some degree of acceptance of the law. If you cannot put every Tom, Dick, and Harry in jail, you have to have millions of jail keepers. If you want to keep somebody in the gutter, you have to go and stand on top of him and put your foot on his back. So there is a limit how much censorship, force, other things can actually accomplish, given the fact that you have a vibrant civil society, liberal nationalists among the youth. The youth tried that in 2009 and see what happened to them. So now they become extremely apathetic to anything. As long as the regime gives them freedom within their compounds, and the regime is doing that, they're happy. And as long as they have a job that pays them well, there has to be something else that organizes them. One thing I've learned in the studying of politics also is that politics gets nowhere without organization. And organization in Iran is extremely difficult because of the regime. But that doesn't mean it will not happen. There's just no way that the regime can go on and on and on in the way it is now. We all had hoped when Khatami became president that there would be reform within the system. That has not happened, unfortunately.
Let me just ask a follow-up question to that as well. You mentioned that during the 2009 protests, the issue was not a matter of regime change, but where is my vote?
Yeah.
But if the president doesn't matter, as Amin was saying, why does the vote matter?
That's very, very interesting. That became elections without democracy. That's what we have. The vote matters because you don't have just vote in the parliament, even though as restricted it is. It's the vote for presidency of those individuals who had been approved by the system, by the Guardians Council, and who were two primary contenders, the former prime minister, before they changed the system, who was quite dogmatic in some way, the former speaker of the Iranian parliament. So we're not talking about nobodies emerging ex nihilo. We're talking about individuals who have proven their loyalty to Islam, Shia Islam, and the Islamic Republic. And then going beyond that and stopping the vote becomes another significant matter. But it's not just voting for the parliament. The votes are being held in Iran regularly, and those are not as much interfered with. For the municipal councils and some of the village councils and so forth. So electoral process, not necessarily democratic electoral process, is part and parcel of that. And this one was really just going one step too far.
Okay, Jonathan Ferrante over here from Smithtown High School in New York State.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your talk. Very informative. Two questions. The first, to what extent could we say that part of the issues that Iran is facing today is because the monarchy, when trying to build some sort of a national identity, was so emphasizing its Persianness that to the exclusion of its Shiism? And if that statement is at all accurate, what hope do you see that there could be some combination of these two types of identities in Iranian society?
Yeah. Really, the question pinpoints a problem. Yes, the regime emphasized its Persianness as opposed to Shiism very, very clearly. But the Shah also had some, you read his book, Message from My Country, I forgot the title of it. He talks about how he was saved from assassins twice because the hidden imam was keeping an eye on him. And I make some other examples of that. But fundamentally, if you look at the golden age of religious and ethnic freedom in Iran in the past, it really was under the second Pahlavi monarch, without any doubt. And of course, Baha'is, even though they were not recognized, they were allowed to function, except one unfortunate episode that took place. But the Persianness, the way it was, it's a little odd, because if you talk about ethnicity and Persianness, it's much more complex, because the Turkish-speaking Iranians are a very central part of that ruling mix. I mean, even today, where is Khamenei from? Is from Azerbaijan, you know. And all throughout, all the great, you know, the five major episodes I talked about, the grand alliances, many of the great leaders of the clerics, of the merchants, and the liberal nationalists were actually Turkish-speaking Persians. The key military element leader that brought the constitutional revolution could not even speak Persian. You know, he spoke only Turkish and so forth. So it's a mixed bag, but yes, your point is absolutely correct. The regime emphasized its non-religious dimension. It glorified pre-Islamic Persia, and even some of the buildings of the government are that style at Persepolis, and so on and so on. But at the same time, kept a very close eye on making sure the clerics were not unhappy. There was a regular subsidy that was given by the regime to the clerics, and the last prime minister of the Shah, one penultimate one, not the last one, actually withdrew that. The Shah regularly consulted with the top religious cleric in the city, holy city of Qom. What made things a bit worse was as Iran became closer and closer as a very key ally of the US in the region, and the Israelis. You know, don't forget, we talk about triangle, Iran, Israel, and US. They were very close allies. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was active and so forth. So, and then the status of forces agreement became a real major thorn in the mind of both Iranian intelligentsia, but especially the clerics, because they said this brings back capitulation, allows American law to be applied for someone who done a criminal act within the country of Iran. So it was a development of a certain number of forces, and the Shah's megalomania. He had to lecture everybody on earth. I have to say one example is very important. On the issue of gender, is a topic I've worked on a bit, I published something on that. But I remember apropos of that, you all know Arianna Fallaci, you all remember her name? She was a major Italian journalist who had the knack into getting under the skin of every world leader. Her interviews with Kissinger, who talked about, I feel like a cowboy going into the horizon. Interviews with Khomeini, with the Shah of Iran, so are fantastic. She eventually turned very right-wing radical later on, but that's not the point. She has an interview with the Shah of Iran. It was published in New Republic in 1970s, and the Shah was before the revolution, at the height of his power. and asked various questions from him. And then there was a rumor. The Iranian government had passed a law called the family law, which essentially did not forbid but made polygamy extremely difficult and allowed abortion on demand. It's another issue that the guys were not happy with. But there was a rumor going on that the Shah has secretly taken a second wife. So Ariana Falaci confronts the Shah in the style she knows and says that, "Is that true, Your Majesty?" He says, "Oh, these are lies. My enemies have done that. No way, no way, no way." And then Falaci goes further and further, and she kind of gets under the skin of the Shah and says that, "I get the sense, Your Majesty, that women don't matter very much to you." This is soon after this very significant law has passed. And women can get elected to the parliament. Women can become judges. There were senators and parliamentarians all around. And then she asks, and he responds saying that, "Yes, you guessed it right. They are nothing other than doing their feminine duties and being a good wife and mother." Falaci goes further, and the Shah gets very angry. And she says, "So we count for nothing?" And the Shah says, "No, for nothing. Now tell me, have you ever produced a great cook? Have you ever produced a Bach or Michelangelo? Not even a great cook. So what are we talking about?" And then they go into politics. So I'm saying that to emphasize there are some elements within Iran that, I should say, are anti-democratic on gender issues, on ethnic minorities, and so forth. But the Turkish-speaking Iranians is a large, large minority and extremely significant. And there's hardly an Iranian family when one side of the family is not of Turkish origin.
Okay, Tiffany Benson, Salesian High School from Richmond, California.
Hi. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the Iranian diaspora and what role they might play in any kind of change that we may see in the future, and if you ever see a possibility of return, especially for the people who left after the revolution in '79.
Well, you have essentially 2 points there. Let me talk with the last one very briefly, and then the first part of it. Yes, I mean, people have been going back and forth, and some, of course, ended up in jail. But a lot of business people and others have gone back and forth. I do recall the first time Ahmadinejad came to New York Assembly, before all the other horrible things he did. I was invited to a session with academics with him, and all academics who spoke Persian. And there were also some business people. One gentleman got up in that meeting and he told Ahmadinejad that, listen, this is of course several years ago, if you look at the Fortune, is it 500 or 400? What is the Fortune 500? Now it's 500. Fortune 500, you look at that, there are about a dozen people who are Iranian Americans or of Iranian origin. Some of them have changed their names. And he said, I am one of them, and I have tons of money. There's nothing I want to do more than put some of my wealth in Iran to benefit the country of my birth. But I cannot do it. Ahmadinejad says, why not? It was a room like this. He said, sir, because of changing laws constantly and corruption. Of course, what did Ahmadinejad say? So it is, a lot of them have gone back. It's become more difficult now because of the severe sanctions, both by the UN and by us, for them to go back. But with the diaspora, I mean, it's a very amorphous group. Nobody knows the exact number. Our census data, you know, you're volunteer, you don't have to do anything, especially all that mixed ancestry. Guesses go very high from 2 million to less. I have no idea, but a lot of them. But we have to understand, there's a large number of Iranians who became Americans, including myself, before the revolution. There were students who stayed. There were people in business, in artists, and so forth. Large group all around, many of them in medical profession. Many of them also became later academics and so forth. Then you had a huge group coming after revolution, essentially in Los Angeles, after it is New York and Washington, and so forth. And this is a very different group. Those who came earlier, they're totally Americanized. Most of the daughters and sons probably can't even speak Persian, but they are connected. They're very proud of that history and civilization, and they maintain ties to other members of the family back there. Newer ones, I'm coming there, many of them have an agenda. You know, there are 7 TV stations, Persian TV stations in Los Angeles. You can't get all of them, but there you go, they can get, you know. But they are not organized. The Iranians in the US, many of them are total secularists, but if you go back along ethnic other lines, you have Iranian Jews. Many of them are in New York area, obviously. There are Iranian Armenians in Los Angeles, Boston, lesser extent in New York and Washington. There are Iranian Christians all over, I mean, other denominations and all that. And of course, Zoroastrians and Baha'is. Zoroastrians are centered around Princeton, New Jersey, close to New York. So they are all around, and they don't have a united view. I remember in the last election, somebody called me for advice, saying that, do you know if there is somebody I can go to who can give me a united Iranian view on the elections for president of the US? I said, I'm sorry, sir. There is no such thing. So it's not an organized group in that sense. Some of them have entered politics in the US, and many of them will in the past, but their influence on Iranian politics in Iran is minimal, I'm afraid.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We'll give it to David DeNaples from the Hopkins School in New Haven, Connecticut.
Hello, and thank you. Some historians have pointed to the toppling of Mossadegh as being the beginning of the problematic relationship between America and Iran. Can you speak to that idea, that that's where the problems began? Can you speak to a little bit about his rule and what potential it may have had, and or what role does he have in Iranian memory today?
I think probably David Chris is going to talk more about that later today, but I'll try to cover some of it. There is a mythology about Dr. Mossadegh that is largely mythology, but some of it is correct, like all myths are. One is that he is the paragon of democracy. Well, if he was the paragon of democracy, how come he abolished Iranian Senate and closed the parliament? How come he chose the avenue of referendums to get his way? So Mossadegh is a mixed bag. It is a personification of some of the important and some democratic ideas borrowed from the West and all that. But Mossadegh is not just a super democratic idol. Furthermore, he made his case, which is on the Grand Coalition, for Iranian oil nationalization at that time. He was supported by all groups, from the left to the right to the middle, ethnic and otherwise. And that coalition, of course, brought him to power. Oil was nationalized. And for really 2 years, there were severe attempts made, especially by the US, and correct me, David, if I'm wrong on that, to try to find a compromise. The Democratic administration was very eager to find a way. And I say this partly because, on a personal basis, my father was a lawyer for the US Embassy and Point Four program. And he was later a senator in Iran. I heard some stories from him as well that maybe others don't know. But that didn't work out. And the coalition fell apart. The coalition, the National Front, large coalition, Mossadegh began to antagonize the religious hierarchy dramatically at some points. He was a secularist, so that's a good point about him. And he lost the support of some of the key people in his government from all different groups. And then, of course, the oil nationalization, they couldn't sell the oil. And the British had the embargo. Whether the embargo was allowed under international law or not is a different matter. In effect, they could not sell the oil and nothing else. So that eventually brought him down, and British were able to persuade us, and President Dulles, remember the Dulles brothers, to undertake the coup. I think David will again support me on that. We didn't know Iran, Americans that is. The British did. So while we were essential for that coup, CIA coup, the British knowledge of Iranian politics inside was absolutely essential. And then, we bought some opposition. We used money, and Chairman Roosevelt claims that, but that wasn't the reason. It was a combination. Now, when revolution succeeded, the idea of nationalism was not, even though they were immersed with it, was not the concept that the Islamic Republic wants, because Islam has no boundaries. It crosses. You cannot be, contained and so forth. So they were, when they began to downplay nationalism, Mossadegh type and so forth, and eventually began to take actions much more severe about that. But Mossadegh remains as a mythical figure still on many people. There are tons of books are coming about him, include a couple of new ones that have come out by Boyandor in England and by the former New York Times reporter.
Kinzer.
No. Yes.
Stephen Kinzer?
Yeah, Stephen Kinzer also wrote about that. Yeah. It was a very important breakpoint in U.S.-Iran relationship. And, I was in a meeting at the Asia Society when the Iranian foreign minister was there and Albright, our Secretary of State, formally apologized for 1953. It's become part and parcel of grievances, some right and some totally concocted on all sides.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Professor Kazemi. I think we've had two great lectures that really draw out the broad themes about Iran that you need as background for understanding the rest of the weekend. Let me just make a few points before we break for lunch. And one is that at the request of one of the teachers, I will be doing for you a cheat sheet that compiles some of the names that you've heard, and just so that you have the correct spellings and what their significance is. And I'll also give you some of the bibliographic references to this 1953 coup that Professor Kazemi mentioned. And in fact, my one regret about this conference is that we didn't have one session devoted to that coup. The book that he mentioned by Dariush Bayandor, which came out a year or two ago, actually makes the case that the CIA's attempted coup did not succeed, and that what happened was that it was the clerics who eventually made that coup succeed. The very clerics who are, in effect, the predecessors of the clerics who are now in power. So there's a lot of back and forth on that issue. I'll give you references for both sides of that issue. Okay, so now we'll break for lunch, and then we'll start again at 12:45. Thank you very much.